In the summer of 1943, the German twin-engine Arado Tu-34 jet bomber took to the skies. Its successful early flights gave engineers at North American Aviation the exact push they needed. This push helped them seriously consider developing their own jet-powered aircraft with similar capabilities. Eventually, this promising project would go down in aviation history as the B-45 Tornado. In the fall of that same year, North American representatives and the leadership of the U.S. Army Air Forces held a series of meetings. Their main goal was to nail down the exact specs the future bomber needed to have. The military brass signed off on the final requirements in early 1944. Right after that, the design team at North American got to work on an ambitious project. It was developed under the working title NA-130. According to the original requirements, the aircraft was to be powered by 4 turbojet engines. It was also to be classified as a heavy bomber. The design looked so promising that by September 8, 1944, the Army Air Forces went ahead. They ordered 3 XB prototypes immediately. In the U.S., military procurement has always been fiercely competitive. A major government contract like this was no exception. Alongside North American, 3 other aviation giants scored contracts to build similar jet bombers. These were Convair, Boeing, and Martin. Interestingly, the military leadership gave these companies almost total freedom. They avoided boxing the designers in with strict limitations. As a result, 4 entirely different concepts were born. 2 of them featured a 4-engine layout. These were North American's XB-45 and Convair's XB-46. The other 2, the Boeing XB-47 and the Martin XB-48, boasted 6 engines. Strictly speaking, classifying these unique aircraft as direct competitors is not entirely accurate. They varied radically in size, geometry, and weight. This was despite being designed for the exact same combat mission. Of the 4, the Martin XB-48 turned out to be the least successful. It suffered from poor aerodynamics and a flawed engine layout for a combat aircraft. Its 6 J-35 turbojets were clustered together in 2 massive pods. There were 3 engines per side. From a survivability standpoint, this was a fatal flaw. A single lucky hit from enemy flak or shrapnel into one of those pods was highly dangerous. It could instantly wipe out half the thrust of the bomber. Because of this, only 2 XB-48 prototypes were ever built. The aircraft made its maiden flight on June 22, 1947. That was essentially the end of its story. Meanwhile, the other 6-engine aircraft, the Boeing XB-47, went in the complete opposite direction. It entered massive, full-scale production after successful flight trials. As for Convair's XB-46, it had fantastic aerodynamics. However, it suffered from one major flaw. Its extremely slender fuselage made it nearly impossible to house the bulky radar systems of the era. On top of that, it was noticeably slower than the design from Boeing. This ultimately sealed its fate. The world only ever saw a single prototype of the XB-46. It made its maiden flight on April 2, 1947. In the end, North American's XB-45 proved to be the most well-rounded design of the group. It offered a balanced platform that delivered exactly what the Air Force needed in operational conditions. However, during the design phase, a new detail became obvious. The aircraft actually fit the profile of a medium bomber rather than a heavy one. Because of this, the Tornado was officially reclassified as a medium bomber. Structurally, it was a classic high-wing design. It featured straight wings and a single vertical stabilizer. Powering the aircraft were 4 Allison J-35 turbojets. These engines were housed under the wings in twin nacelles. They were designed with highly refined aerodynamics. Engineers developed this design working closely with leading aerodynamicists from NACA. Operating this highly advanced aircraft required a crew of 4. This included 2 pilots, a navigator, and a gunner. In 1945, work on the aircraft was moving at a rapid pace. Design teams practically lived at the facility. They pored over blueprints for 12 to 14 hours a day. However, after the war in Europe ended, the urgent need for new bombers faded. Development slowed down. It was not until August 2, 1946 that the United States Army Air Forces officially approved the B-45 Tornado for production. They placed an initial order for 96 bombers. The very first prototype was prepped for flight testing in early 1947. To maintain strict secrecy, the B-45 was disassembled and covertly transported to the famous Muroc Air Base. That is exactly where all early American jet aircraft made their maiden flights. This took place in a restricted area of the test facility. The historic event took place on March 17, 1947, when test pilots completed its maiden flight. In December of that same year, the second prototype joined the testing program. It was equipped with ejection seats for the pilots. This was a highly innovative feature for the time. In an emergency, however, the navigator and gunner still had to bail out conventionally. They had to exit through traditional escape hatches. Interestingly, neither of these early experimental prototypes featured a pressurized cabin yet. This made high-altitude test flights a grueling endurance test for the crew. In September 1948, the first prototype took to the sky for another flight. The main goal was to test the new J-47 GE-7 jet engines. However, disaster struck mid-flight when a fuel line ruptured. The line sprayed jet fuel directly onto the hot engine section, instantly igniting a fire. The pilot put the aircraft into a steep dive, hoping the increased airflow would blow out the flames. Unfortunately, the maneuver failed. With the situation turning critical, the crew pitched up to gain altitude for a safe parachute bailout. But they ran out of time. One of the burning engines exploded. The explosion sent debris from the casing flying back. This completely sheared off the horizontal stabilizer. The aircraft snapped into an uncontrollable dive and crashed. Despite this tragedy, the test program was not halted. They pressed on with the two remaining prototypes. Engineers carefully analyzed the crash data and implemented critical design changes. From then on, a reliable automatic fire suppression system was integrated into all subsequent Tornadoes. Additionally, the horizontal stabilizer span was increased by nearly 7 feet. The hydraulic flight controls of the aircraft also received a major upgrade to maximize safety. In total, these experimental Tornadoes logged 131 test flights. The second prototype, designated B-45, made its final flight on May 15, 1950. When the intense flight test program finally wrapped up, this airframe avoided the scrapyard. Instead, it was transferred to the Air Training Command. There, it found a second life as a ground trainer for future bomber crews. The first true production version of the Tornado bomber was the B-45A1. However, the manufacturer immediately ran into a problem. There was a severe shortage of the brand new J-47 engines. All available units at the time were being diverted exclusively to higher priority strategic aircraft, like the B-47 and the F-86. Because of this, the first batch of A-1 series bombers had to be fitted with less powerful J-35A9 or J-35A11 engines. Each of these engines produced around 4,400 pounds of thrust. In early 1948, the first production B-45A1 flew to Muroc Air Force Base. There, it joined the experimental B-45s for a joint flight testing program. By the end of that year, the factory assembly line had managed to roll out 22 new Tornado bombers, but their delivery to Air Force combat units suddenly stalled. The main reason was simply a lack of funds in the defense budget. Congress had underfunded the military for that fiscal year. This meant a lot of promising programs were either frozen or completely canceled. All the B-45s that had already been built had to be temporarily put into storage. It was not until the spring of 1949 that the Air Force finally secured the funding to pull these aircraft out. This allowed them to form the 47th Light Bombardment Wing based out of Barksdale Air Force Base. Visually, the production B-45A1s were easily distinguishable from the experimental prototypes. For one, they featured updated engine intakes. These intakes had a built-in thermal anti-icing system to prevent ice buildup at high altitudes. Engineers also reshaped the glass in the pilot canopy and navigator compartment to improve overall visibility. There was another noticeable detail. Instead of a single massive nose wheel, the production aircraft were fitted with a dual-wheel nose gear assembly. This significantly improved ground handling on the runway. The production Tornado bombers received a highly advanced avionics suite for the time. The aircraft were equipped with an E-4 autopilot and modern radar. They also featured powerful systems for signals intelligence and electronic countermeasures. To make things more practical for the crew, special fold-out steps were integrated into the sides of the fuselage. This made it much easier to climb into the navigator and tail gunner stations. When it came to combat performance, the early B-45A1 was a truly formidable bomber. It could carry up to 10,000 pounds of mixed ordnance. With this payload, the aircraft had a range of 750 nautical miles. It could also reach speeds up to 450 knots. Designers divided the bomb bay into two separate sections. Interestingly, a 1,268-gallon auxiliary fuel tank could be installed in the rear bay. This would substantially extend the flight range. A typical combat loadout, however, consisted of 27 500-pound bombs. The crew could accurately deliver this payload even at high speeds of around 430 knots. To keep the high-speed airflow from disrupting the ordnance as it dropped from the bay, engineers designed a special set of sliding doors. These effectively reduced turbulence under the fuselage, ensuring a clean release. During large-scale tests in 1950, various bombs were dropped from the aircraft. These bombs weighed anywhere from 500 to 4,000 pounds. They were dropped at an altitude of nearly 20,000 feet. Following these tests, the Air Force deemed the bombing accuracy fully satisfactory for combat operations. To defend against interceptors, the aircraft was equipped with defensive armament. This consisted of two 50-caliber Colt Browning M7 machine guns. These were housed in a conical fairing right at the tail of the bomber. Ammo capacity was generous, with 1,200 rounds allocated per gun. This gave the tail gunner a solid capability to fend off pursuers. To allow command to accurately assess strike results, a Fairchild AK-17 aerial camera was mounted on each aircraft. It was positioned just aft of the bomb bay to capture bomb damage in detail. Entering active service, the B-45 quickly revealed a host of serious issues. It turned out that during hard maneuvers, especially at low altitudes, the airframe would suffer from the stress. It experienced severe structural flexing. The engines had a notoriously short time between overhauls and a dangerous tendency to catch fire. To make matters worse, there was a severe budget shortfall for purchasing replacement turbojets. Air Force leadership believed it was far more critical to prioritize those engines for the latest F-86 Sabre fighters. Furthermore, the E-4 autopilot frequently failed right as the bomb bay doors opened. The airspeed indicators and fuel flow meters were wildly inaccurate. Constant breakdowns in the cabin pressurization system meant crews had to strictly limit their cruising altitude. The bombing and navigation system only added to their headaches. Crews complained that the onboard radar constantly lost track of targets. Poor antenna placement severely restricted its radar coverage. The last aircraft from the first production batch was delivered to the Air Force in the spring of 1950. Subsequent bombers were fitted with more reliable and powerful General Electric J-47 GE-11 engines. Their maximum thrust reached around 5,200 pounds, with a compressor water injection system that figure jumped to nearly 6,000 pounds. Engineers also had to urgently redesign the cockpit canopy, reinforcing it with a heavy steel frame. Early flights had shown that dangerous microcracks were forming in the plexiglass due to stress and fatigue. This did not just hurt visibility, it compromised the vital cabin pressurization. In total, 47 of these updated bombers rolled off the assembly line. All of them joined the 47th Bombardment Wing. Meanwhile, back in 1947, designers had already begun working on a major upgrade for the aircraft, the B-45C variant. Full-scale production kicked off in April 1950. To toughen up the airframe, engineers switched to a much stronger 75 ST aluminum alloy. They also heavily overhauled the fuel system. This meant the entire aircraft could now be fueled through a single-point refueling receptacle located just to the left of the bomb bay. The canopy glass was reinforced even further. The capacity of the auxiliary wingtip drop tanks was increased to 1,125 gallons. Additionally, all aircraft in this series were factory-equipped with a Boeing aerial refueling system. The boom receptacle for this setup was conveniently positioned right on the upper mid-fuselage. This updated bomber took to the skies for its first flight on May 3, 1949. Initially, the Air Force ordered 43 of these aircraft. However, plans shifted during production. They decided to build only 10 standard bombers. The remaining 33 airframes were converted into strategic reconnaissance aircraft, designated as the RB-45C. Production for these variants wrapped up in mid-April 1950. Since the new Recon variant was noticeably heavier, it needed more thrust for a safe takeoff. As mentioned earlier, thrust was boosted using water injection in the engine compressors. Because of this, they had to carry a larger water supply on board. To accommodate this, they added 2 special pylons to the aft fuselage. These pylons held extra water drop tanks with a capacity of about 215 gallons each. If needed, these tanks could be swapped out for 2 solid fuel RATO boosters. This helped the heavy aircraft get airborne. The nose of the Recon variant had to be radically redesigned. For example, they completely removed the glazing from the navigator's compartment. They turned it into a solid, all-metal nose. In the aft fuselage, they built a specialized, pressurized compartment with its own climate control system. This was absolutely critical for the reliable operation of the new S7A high-altitude camera. It also supported the complex motion picture cameras housed there. Interestingly, Eastman Kodak built most of this cutting-edge camera equipment. The navigator operating these systems used a camera setup that was truly ahead of its time. It shot photos with a 10-inch frame diagonal. From an altitude of over 30,000 feet, a single photo could cover a staggering 2,700 square miles of terrain. The aircraft's bomb bay was modified to hold an auxiliary fuel tank with a capacity of nearly 1,190 gallons. For night missions, the crew could drop 22 M122 photoflash bombs to illuminate the target. Interestingly, the very first Recon variants, known as the B-45C1, carried no defensive armament whatsoever. Over time, though, all of these aircraft were fitted with the new A1 tail turret. This turret was paired with the APG-30 radar. Other variants of the bomber eventually received this same defensive suite. Beyond the 4 main variants of the Tornado, there were also some highly specialized versions. For example, in 1951, 14 bombers were converted into trainers and designated as the TB-45A2. This modification work was done at the North American facility in Norton. To save weight, crews stripped out the cockpit armor, defensive guns, and other unnecessary tactical equipment. Later on, a few more airframes were modified the exact same way for pilot training. Early variants of the Tornado also found a second life as target tugs, towing aerial targets manufactured by Vought. To do this, massive cable winches were mounted in the bomb bay. These winches spooled out over 6,000 feet of tow cable. This allowed the bomber to tow the target at a safe distance. The target drone, designated the X-27A, was produced in massive numbers. Its all-metal design made it an excellent radar reflector. It also proved incredibly easy to maintain and repair. By using these streamlined targets, towing speeds jumped significantly. They went from 260 knots all the way up to 390 knots. However, trainers based on the early Tornado airframes were not entirely successful. They fell short of Air Force requirements. The primary issue was a lack of engine thrust. This made the aircraft difficult for student pilots to manage. Because of this, the military started pulling bombers from later production blocks. They converted those into trainers instead. This led to the creation of the TB-45C1. These had a solid service life stretching into the late 1950s. A few airframes were still flying as late as 1962. In addition, several aircraft were converted into specialized director aircraft, designated as the DB-45. Their mission was to fly out and remotely pilot target drones in mid-air. Some aircraft in the Tornado family took on a completely different role. They became true flying laboratories. These airframes were used as test beds for new jet engines. To make this work, a special retractable pylon was mounted in the forward bomb bay to hold the test engine. Meanwhile, up front in the navigator's compartment, the usual gear was swapped out. It was replaced with complex data recorders and a suite of extra flight test instrumentation. The final upgrade in the Tornado's history was intended to be the B-45B model. The plan was to outfit it with state-of-the-art navigation and bombing avionics. It also included a radar-guided tail turret tied to a new fire control system. However, this ambitious project never made it off the drawing board. Interestingly, engineers even looked into creating a military transport version of the B-45. But those plans failed to materialize as well. There were also some highly classified variants of the B-45 bomber that never even received a unique designation. Their sole mission was nuclear weapon delivery. What is fascinating is that the engineers at North American simply could not design a purpose-built nuclear bomber from scratch at the time. The level of secrecy surrounding these new weapons was so extreme, the designers did not even know the rough dimensions or weight of the atomic bombs they were supposed to be building the aircraft around. The urgent need to arm the B-45 with a nuclear payload arose in the late 1940s. This happened when a new generation of weapons, the Mark V and Mark VII series, entered the inventory. This top-secret modernization program was codenamed Project Backbreaker. The massive refit was carried out in 1951. Engineers heavily modified the forward bomb bay and upgraded the avionics on 53 aircraft. This fully certified them to drop atomic weapons. One of these upgraded aircraft was assigned to the now famous 49 25th Test Group. Their fleet included all the nuclear-capable aircraft of the era. This included the legendary B-29, B-47, and B-52 bombers. Crews from this elite unit dropped live nuclear weapons on the Nevada test site and the remote Kwajalein Atoll. The B-45 made a historic flight on May 1, 1952. It dropped a 19-kiloton Mark VII nuclear weapon over the Nevada test site. The bomber was cruising at a speed of about 240 knots. It was flying at an altitude of over 19,000 feet. The weapon detonated at approximately 1,050 feet above ground level. After the bomber successfully returned to base, ground crews thoroughly inspected all onboard systems. They also checked the cockpit for radiation. The results were clear. The Tornado was fully ready for real-world nuclear strike missions. In May 1952, these formidable bombers were deployed to Europe. They operated out of air bases in the United Kingdom. Shortly after, Tornadoes were also flying patrols over France, Germany, and Turkey. This era lasted until 1958. At that time, the B-45s in Europe were replaced by a newer and more advanced tactical bomber. This was the Douglas B-66 destroyer. Various models of the B-45 Tornado bomber and the RB-45 reconnaissance aircraft served the United States Air Force faithfully for an entire decade. This service lasted from 1948 to 1958. The very last flight for this legendary family took place much later. In 1971, a B-45 took to the skies one last time. It was on a ferry flight to its permanent home at the National Air and Space Museum. In total, North American Aviation built 142 B-45s across all variants during its production run. In 1950, the United States High Command decided to utilize RB-45 reconnaissance aircraft for covert missions over the Soviet Union. The primary goal was to create highly accurate radar maps of key industrial areas and critical military installations. To conceal the origin of these operations, the military arranged to fly these missions with strictly British crews instead of Americans. The logic was simple. If an aircraft was shot down and the pilots captured, they could claim they had just drifted off course during a training flight. To make the cover story more convincing, all United States Air Force markings were completely stripped from the fuselages. They were replaced with British roundels. These top-secret missions launched in April 1952. They flew through the skies of East Germany, the Baltic states, the outskirts of Moscow, and the southern regions of Russia and Ukraine. When the Korean War broke out, only the reconnaissance variants of the RB-45 Tornado were deployed. Why was the United States so reluctant to use its first jet-powered medium bomber in this conflict? The primary reason was the sudden appearance of the latest Soviet MiG-15 fighters in Korean skies. The fear of inevitable and heavy losses forced United States commanders to significantly limit the use of these aircraft. Plus, the steep price tag of the airplane itself played a major role. It cost over $1 million. For comparison, even the massive and legendary B-29 Superfortress cost much less at the time. It came in at around $639,000. All the RB-45's flying combat missions over Korea belonged to the most elite reconnaissance unit within Strategic Air Command at the time. The RB-45 crews were tasked with a critical mission. They were continuously monitoring the airfields where enemy fighters were based. These aircraft carried out their reconnaissance runs mostly during the day. However, they occasionally flew under the cover of darkness. Their survival tactic was simple but effective. The moment Soviet MiG-15s appeared in the air, the recon planes would instantly turn around. They would then make a dash for the coast at top speed. This was a safe haven because Soviet pilots were strictly forbidden from flying over open water. The B-45 crews continued their dangerous missions right up to the very last day of the war. However, starting in mid-1951, some of their workload was taken over by the smaller, more agile RF-80 and RF-86 tactical recon jets. These jets were much better suited to survive in the infamous MiG alley. The first B-45s began arriving in Japan back in the fall of 1950. This was after long ferry flights from American air bases in Alaska. The Tornadoes made the large military bases on the Japanese islands their new home in the Far East Theater of Operations. By late November, these jets began flying regular reconnaissance missions. Their main targets remained the military airfields of North Korea. Thanks to their ability to fly at extreme altitudes, the B-45s were practically untouchable by older enemy piston engine fighters like the LA-9 and Yak-9. This allowed the Americans to carry out their assigned tasks with near impunity. However, this operational advantage ended with the introduction of MiG jet interceptors. Despite early combat losses to these new aircraft, the Tornado remained an absolutely unique asset for a while. It was the only recon plane capable of taking off from Japan and reliably reaching remote North Korean airfields. Moreover, during those early days, only the massive B-45 had the speed and durability to make it back home in one piece after a dangerous run over MiG Alley. As the war progressed, the B-45s repeatedly became prime targets for interceptors. Starting in 1952, Tornadoes never took to the skies without a heavy fighter escort. Eventually, the Air Force decided to shift these aircraft to night reconnaissance missions. To pull this off, their fuselages were painted flat black so they would blend seamlessly into the night sky. Even after the Korean War wound down, the B-45C reconnaissance planes remained active. They continued flying high-risk missions along the borders of North Korea, China, and the Soviet Union. Occasionally, these flights inevitably sparked tense military incidents and interceptions, but the aircraft remained in active reconnaissance service. In terms of internal layout, the B-45 Tornado bomber and its reconnaissance variants were large, all-metal aircraft designed for a four-man crew. It featured a classic, high-mounted straight-wing design. Propulsion came from 4 jet engines housed in twin nacelles on each wing. The landing gear utilized a traditional tricycle layout, which was standard for the early jet age. The aircraft's fuselage was incredibly sturdy. It was built around 5 main sections, making for a reliable and well-engineered airframe. The lower nose section featured a specialized dielectric radome that housed the main search radar. A glazed bombardier nose sat just above it. On the reconnaissance version, this glass was replaced by a solid fairing that concealed a suite of powerful still and motion picture cameras. In either configuration, the nose section served as the operational center of the aircraft's navigation and bombing systems. The second section housed the crew compartment. This is where the navigator bombardier or photo recon operator sat. Behind him, up in the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot sat in tandem ejection seats. The pilot and navigator compartments were fully pressurized. They featured an air conditioning system to keep the crew comfortable at high altitude. These compartments were connected by a narrow crawlway along the left side. The airmen used this crawlway to reach their seats. The crew actually entered the bomber through a special oval door on the left side of the fuselage. That massive, transparent teardrop canopy over the pilots was strictly for visibility. It was not for getting in and out of the aircraft. Beneath the navigator's station, a secure compartment was set aside for the heavy aircraft batteries. The instrumentation allowed the crew to confidently fly the aircraft day or night, even in the toughest weather conditions. To make the gauges easier to read, engineers tilted the main instrument panel at a 15-degree angle. All the critical flight indicators that demanded constant attention were grouped dead center and to the right. Meanwhile, the secondary gauges were placed on the left. Since the co-pilot could easily see the main panel from his seat, his dash only duplicated the basic flight instruments. To make sure the needles on the electromechanical dials didn't stick during flight, the designers implemented a specialized instrument panel vibrator to maintain smooth operation. As for safety, the ejection seats were developed by North American Aviation, who integrated experienced German engineers to assist with the design. In the third center fuselage section sat the main fuel tank, directly above a spacious bomb bay with massive doors. The wing's main structural spar passed right through this section. Just aft of that sat the hydraulics for the flaps and landing gear, along with the air conditioning units. On the Recon models, some of that bomb capacity was repurposed to accommodate an extra fuel tank into the bay. This gave the aircraft extended range. Further aft, the fourth section of the fuselage accommodated heavy-duty cameras, specifically on the B-45C1 Recon variant. Right next to that was a life raft stowage area, followed immediately by two massive ammo boxes for the tail guns. To access this ammo, ground crews had to open specific hatches on the underside of the fuselage. The radar altimeter was also housed here, with its antenna clearly visible from the outside. Up on top of this same fuselage section, engineers installed the aerial refueling receptacle. This was a crucial feature for extended range missions. This section also served as the mounting point for the tail bumper, the aerodynamic speed brakes, and the bomber's entire tail assembly. The fifth and final section housed the tail gunner's compartment. To get to his station, the gunner used a forward-facing door on the right side of the aircraft. To facilitate access, a built-in drop-down ladder was included. The aircraft featured a highly robust three-spar wing design. Structurally, it consisted of a center section that was integrated directly into the fuselage and ended at the engine nacelles, along with two outer wing panels. These outer panels mated with the center section right where the engines were mounted. Inside that center wing section, designers built roomy wheel wells to house the main landing gear struts and wheels. They also accommodated two fuel tanks, securing them safely between the forward main spars. Along the trailing edge of the center wing section were two sets of slotted flaps. These could be set to three specific positions, retracted for normal flight, takeoff, and landing. Structurally, the left and right outer wing panels were built very similarly to the center section. They featured flaps and ailerons on their trailing edges. However, their interiors housed a total of 8 integral fuel tank cells. On the C model, external drop tanks could be mounted directly on the wingtips. Each of those held about 1,125 gallons of fuel. This greatly extended the bomber's operational range. The bomber's vertical tail featured 3 spars, while the horizontal stabilizer had 2. Engineers ran into an issue with turbulent wake coming off the wings, so they had to move the elevators completely out of that turbulent wake. To fix this, they gave the stabilizer a pronounced dihedral of 10.5 degrees. To ensure clear radio communication, the upper section of the tail fin was made of a special radio-transparent fiberglass, perfectly concealing the high-frequency antenna underneath. The landing gear utilized a conventional tricycle configuration. In flight, the nose gear retracted straight back into the fuselage. The main gear struts, on the other hand, retracted into the wings, pivoting inward toward the aircraft's centerline. A robust hydraulic system handled this entire extension and retraction process. An interesting design feature was the retractable tail bumper. This would drop down during takeoff and landing to protect the rear fuselage from tail strikes. This was a safety measure in case the pilot over-rotated and risked scraping the runway. The primary power plant across all variants consisted of 4 jet engines. They were paired in 2 large underslung nacelles beneath the wings. Inside these engine pods, designers tightly packed the fuel controls, oil tanks holding just over 9 gallons each, and large 214-gallon water tanks. This water fed an injection system that sprayed directly into the engine compressors to provide a temporary boost in thrust. To contain potential fires in case of an emergency, adjacent engines in each pod were separated by a firewall. The power plant's job was not limited just to generating thrust. Hot bleed air tapped from the compressors was used to inflate hollow rubber canopy seals. This maintained cabin pressurization. This same bleed air fed the air conditioning system. It also pressurized the hydraulic systems. It even drove the generator that powered all the aircraft's avionics. If extra thrust was needed, for example during a max gross weight takeoff, the A and C series bomber variants could be fitted with solid fuel, JATO booster rockets. They provided a massive surge in acceleration. As soon as their fuel burned out, the spent casings were simply jettisoned. Early versions of the bomber, like the B-45A1 and the B-45A2 prototypes, were powered by Allison engines, specifically the J-35A11 model. Each unit weighed over 2,427 pounds. It produced around 3,946 pounds of thrust. When the water injection system was used, that number jumped to 4,740 pounds of thrust. Eventually, the Air Force demanded significantly more power, so on later variants, the B-45A5, the B-45C1, and the B-45C1 reconnaissance aircraft, they introduced the brand new J-47, GE-13, and J-47, GE-15 engines from General Electric. Engine weight increased to 2,502 pounds. However, dry takeoff thrust jumped to 4,938 pounds. With water injection, it reached an impressive 5,864 pounds of thrust. Keeping those powerful jet engines fed was no easy task. The aircraft had a massive total fuel capacity of 6,876 gallons. This fuel was distributed throughout the airplane. One massive tank sat in the fuselage. Meanwhile, 22 smaller cells were tucked inside the wings. But even that was not always enough. For the A5 and C1 variants, engineers found a way to significantly increase the range. An extra 1,190-gallon tank could be installed in the aft bomb bay. On top of that, the C1 variant could carry wingtip tanks. Each added another 1,125 gallons of jet fuel. Later on, they also developed sleek, teardrop-shaped drop tanks for the aircraft. Each one held roughly 499 gallons of fuel. They were mounted directly beneath the engine nacelles. During the production run, the C1 variant was equipped for in-flight refueling. They used KB-50 tankers. These transferred fuel through a specialized flying boom developed by Boeing. This capability massively expanded the bomber's combat radius. The bomb load of this aircraft was substantial. It maxed out at over 22,000 pounds. Inside its two spacious bomb bays, it could carry an entire arsenal of standard 500-pound bombs. Alternatively, it could carry a single gigantic British Grand Slam bomb weighing exactly 22,000 pounds. Aside from conventional ordnance, the Tornado was also capable of carrying nuclear weapons in its forward bay, specifically the Mark V and Mark VII atomic bombs. To drop this devastating payload with maximum accuracy, the Bombardier used an optical periscope bomb sight. Alternatively, they used what was at the time an advanced radar system paired with a dedicated ballistic computer. There was also a dedicated reconnaissance version of the bomber, designated as the B-45C1. It could carry up to 25 M122 photo-flash bombs. These were absolutely essential for nighttime reconnaissance missions. When it came to self-defense, the crew was well protected. The defensive armament consisted of two powerful 50-caliber Browning M7 machine guns mounted in the tail turret. At first, the Tornado's tail gunner aimed using a standard optical sight, but engineers at Motor Products later replaced it with a more modern automated system. This was integrated with a fire control radar for precise targeting even in low visibility. The ammo loadout was highly capable. There were exactly 1,200 rounds per gun. These were safely stored in heavy ammunition cans right behind the gunner's station.